Welcome to Massive Passive Cash Flow, the podcast that guides professionals to financial prosperity. Join our community and let's start building your wealth. Here's your host, Gary Wilson.
Welcome back to the Massive Passive Cash Flow podcast. I'm Gary Wilson, your host, and I'm glad to have you back listening to the show. We got a great guest today, Joel Friedland from beautiful Illinois. If you've never been out there, it's a great state. Illinois is not just Chicago. Check out the state, and it's a lot of fun, a lot of awesome people too, and some great investing opportunities. And you're right smack in the middle of the country too. So Joel, thanks for joining us. I see what you're doing. I read your bio, and I know we've spoken beforehand, and I pleasantly uh, feel blessed that you're here, giving us your time and your wisdom. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Gary. I've enjoyed watching you on podcasts as well. So it's my pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And hey, if you wouldn't mind, I definitely want to jump into what you're doing, with the properties and how you're structuring the deals. Would you mind giving us a little bit of a lead up? How did you actually where did you start from, and what took you to this point? Because I like me, I was in computer science. I had nothing to do with real estate when I first started, but I'm just best place I've ever been is real estate.
Well, I became an entrepreneur at age 14.
Mhm.
A beautiful sunny day in April when I was 14 years old. My parents were out of town, and we had this neighbor couple, a young couple that had no kids, agreed to stay with me and with my two younger brothers. And I decided to become an entrepreneur. I went into the lawn cutting business. So on this beautiful April day, it was a Saturday, I started walking up and down the street, and I'd stop at each home and I'd walk in and say, how would you like it if I cut your lawn this year? I'm going to have a lawn business. And at the end of the weekend, by dark on Sunday night, I had accumulated 70 customers on a list.
Nice.
That was cold calling. So
Yeah.
this is a theme. So when I was 22 years old, I graduated from the University of Michigan with a liberal arts degree. And I decided that, having watched people for years during the summer while I was running my lawn business, I had a bunch of employees. I had 30 kids working for me. I got to see what was happening with the homes. And what I saw was a sign would go up for sale, and there would be showings, and I talked to the agents, and I started to really like real estate. So I decided at age 22 to go into real estate. I cold called the owner of a real estate company. I didn't know him. He was a guy named Milton Podolsky, 64 years old, which is what I am now. And I cold called, I said, Mr. Podolsky, I've seen your signs in town, and I would like to come to work in the real estate business. He said, you're just calling me out of the blue? I said, yeah. He said, well, then you better come in. So I went to his office and I sat with him. It was 1981. Interest rates were 17%. And he says, Joel, I own 84 industrial buildings. I'm a syndicator, and I have hundreds of partners, and there's a recession on right now. I don't know if you're aware of it, but I've got 10 vacant buildings out of my 84 buildings, and I need someone to go fill them up. And I said, well, I'll help you with that. I said, I'm a cold caller. And I told him the landscaping story. And I said, what I'm going to do is I'll go door to door in industrial parks. I will not take no for an answer. I will walk into the front office of every company, and I'll simply ask them if they're looking to move somewhere nearby, and tell them we have a building for lease. And I filled up 9 of his 10 vacancies literally within about 6 months. I started in August, a beautiful summer day. I reported to work, and I started walking door to door in industrial parks. And since then, Milt taught me. He was my mentor, and his son Steve was my mentor as well. And they taught me how to be a syndicator, because that's what they did. And I started syndicating deals at a very young age, all industrial, because that's what I was taught. I just stuck with it, and I was laser focused. And I started buying properties, and up to date, we've bought over 100 industrial properties all over the country. And today I'm focusing mostly in the Chicago area because it's the best industrial market in the United States. Right smack dab in the middle. Yep. Railroad, right in the middle of the country. So anything that's delivered by rail, it applies. Trucking lines, all the major highways and tollways.
Yep.
Airport, O'Hare Airport, which is one of the largest. And in Chicago, there's 22,000 industrial companies, 16,000 industrial buildings, and it's 1.5 billion square feet. So I don't have to get on an airplane to go anywhere to stay busy and buy buildings and have investments. I can do it right here, where I've been to maybe 15,000 of the 16,000 buildings.
Wow. Well, you're absolutely right. You actually got two good sized airports out there.
Yeah, Midway
Yeah.
is secondary. O'Hare's the main thing.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Great. And I won't get into it, but here obviously amazing story of the person that airport is named after, So
Butch.
yeah. Anybody
Yeah.
that's not familiar with that, get the book and read it. I mean, it's just an amazing story. So in any case, well, you definitely are one of the primes. I love Chicago. I've been there many times teaching and even vacationing. It's one of the few big cities that I would consider a destination area. People actually will go there because it's just fun. I mean, you're right on the water. You got the Navy Pier and some beautiful architecture, a river running right through town. It's just I'm not knocking New York, but sorry, New York, you can't compete with Chicago when it comes to and I know people right now are going to throw darts at me, but everybody's been to both cities will tell you the same thing. It's Chicago's just easier to navigate. I mean, the grid system, once you figure out the north and south, and people are friendly. You ask for help, people will help you out. I'm not saying
Yeah.
they won't do that in New York, but it's not the same. So, in any case, back to investing. Um, so right away you started in the syndicating, which is pretty awesome because usually, like for me, I started off with a little teeny 4-bedroom home, and then I got another home, finally I got a duplex, and then I got a fourplex, and all that took years before I bought the big 90-unit behemoth. But I've known a few people also. One of my good friends, an investor too, Andy Cushman. His first property was a 94-unit building. I'm like, Andy, you're nuts, man. But you know what? He knocked it out of the park. He's an engineer, very methodical. Like does his research, gathers the data, and sticks to his formula. He does not go outside the bounds. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you're doing what you're doing? What's your process? I know there's probably you could spend 10 days discussing the nuts and bolts of it, but I want people to hear how you've been able to do what you're doing because the one thing to see for themselves, if you're a dentist, even if you're a pilot, you don't want to gear, I don't have time for this. Well, you actually do once you figure this stuff out. But would you mind sharing a little bit about that, Joel? How did you develop this process?
Yeah, sure. So Milt Podolsky had all these investors, and one day he said to me, "Hey kid," this was early on. He says, "I'm buying a property in a town called Wheeling, which is a suburb of O'Hare. It's about it's really close to O'Hare." So he said,
Hmm.
I'm going to be putting a deal together, and I need you to go pick up a check from the rabbi." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, my rabbi. I belong to a congregation, and the rabbi is one of my investors. And he didn't want to send the check by mail, so I told him I'd send the kid." So he said to me, so I went over and I met the rabbi, and he gives me an envelope and he says, "Do you know what this is for?" I said, "I do. It's for an investment in Wheeling." He said, "Do you like Wheeling?" I said, "Well, um, it's in Cook County, which is
Hmm.
where the real estate taxes are higher than just over the border, about 5 minutes away, but it's a great location." He said, "Do you
Hmm.
think this deal will do well?" I said, "Honestly, Rabbi, I'm not that familiar with what the deal is. Milt just sent me as an errand boy to pick up the check." I
Hmm.
said, "But I wish you luck." And that's the first time that I ever had an interaction with an investor.
Hmm.
All the investors want to know is this a good place? Is it a good building? Is it a safe investment? Does it have a future of appreciation and value? Those were the things that he cared about the most.
Hmm.
So I didn't learn that in that encounter. But when I went to Milton, I said, "I want to do my first syndication where I put it together." He said, "Well, I'll put up a third of the money. I'll let you call all of my investors, but you have to call them to get them to invest and explain the deal. And then you've got to bring in some of your own people." And
Okay.
as a leasing agent for him, I had met a lot of business owners, and I had a tremendous, in those days, Rolodex, because I grew up in the area and my family had a lot of friends and we had cousins. And so I had a lot of people. And that first deal, I went out and I brought in $20,000 from each investor. And it was a very small deal. It was $560,000. And it was a
Okay.
freestanding 14,000 square foot building in a town called Gurnee, Illinois, which was not as well located as Wheeling. And we got lucky and turned into a decent deal, and it gave us a 10% cash flow starting right away. And it had no debt. There was no debt, no mortgage.
Yeah.
And the rent over a number of years went up. And by the time I was in my early 40s, we were earning about a 14% cash on cash return year in and year out. My favorite
Nice.
time of the year is at the end of each quarter when I send out quarterly cash flow distributions. So that was the first of about 100 buildings that we bought. And they follow a formula. The formula is find a great building with a good location for manufacturers where they can get good labor and they can get their trucks in and out to get the products that they manufacture. They bring in raw material that's trucked in, and then they do something, they make something, they manufacture something, and then it's shipped out to their customers. And it has to have a high enough ceiling that they can stack their products in what they call racks. Those are where you put your pallets. Pallets are material stacked up on a piece of wood. That's a palletized series of products and boxes. And it's got to have some office in the front. And one of the biggest things, it's got to have great parking. Industrial buildings without great parking are useless, because if you're a manufacturing company, you've got to have enough room for your people to park, because you can't count on being able to park on a street, because the village can say, hey, no street parking. And then you can't have any employees. So the first three rules of industrial real estate are parking, parking, and parking.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny. I never heard that, because I'm most of my background was residential, multifamily housing. We did some retail and stores and things like that, but industrial I did very little of. But it makes total sense. I mean, if you think about it, I used to live near a Sony plant. And all they made was the big screens, the big screens when they first came out. And that parking lot was huge, but it's because they had a lot of employees, and it just never occurred to me how important that was. And that place was middle of nowhere too, by the way. Very interesting. So, in any case, and it used to be a Volkswagen plant, and it sat empty for over 10 years before they found the new tenant, which is also interesting to me, because it just goes to show you it's a long play. Industrials is a long-term play, and if you don't have debt, I want to talk about the having no debt too. You know, you can do that kind of stuff without having to do a lot of cash calls and dip in your capital and keep things going if you have loans. But so is most of what you've done industrial then? Is that pretty much the bulk of it?
I tried twice to do something different. I had a partner who wanted to try doing some retail, and we bought two
hmm
properties back in 2007, which was terrible timing,
hmm
to do some retail development. These were actually land deals; they were not buildings, and we got killed. We got slaughtered. The
Yeah.
losses we took on both deals were significant, and what I learned were two things. Number one, I'm not a land guy, because I'm not a developer. I only buy existing buildings that are ready to
Right.
go. And secondly, I have to stay in my lane. I believe that focus is really important. I don't know if you can see it, but I had a little surgery. I had a basal cell on my nose, and I went to the dermatologist and I said, hey, I got this thing. And he says, oh, I'm going to take a biopsy. And he took a biopsy, and 2 days later he calls and he says, hey, sorry, I've got bad news. It's a little basal cell carcinoma. You have to have it removed. And you're going to
hmm
go to Dr. Lottie in Northbrook, Illinois, and he is one of the two preeminent Mohs surgeons. Mohs is MOHS, named after a doctor from Wisconsin, where they take a
hmm
little layer of skin off and they make sure the cancer is all gone. They don't dig in, and then if they don't get it, they do another layer, And then they
Okay.
actually do plastic surgery to stitch it up. I had such confidence in Dr. Lati because my parents had been to him for their little cancer things. My in-laws had something similar. So who are you going to trust with your face? I mean, talk
Yeah.
about, right? I mean,
Yeah.
real estate's one thing, but your face is something else. So who do you go to? You go to the most experienced person that's got a good reputation, who knows what he's doing. Same thing with airline pilots. I played golf with an American airline pilot who was an international pilot, and he starts hitting the ball and it's going like way off to the right, slicing way off to
Like
the
me.
left. Yeah. And I said to him, "You don't fly like that, do you?" He said,
Yeah.
"No, we
Yeah.
don't slice and we don't hook. We go straight." So
Yeah.
you want the best pilot, you want the best doctor, you want the best lawyer, you want the best accountant. And in my case, the way to be the best is to know my market cold, to have been to all 15,000 buildings, and to know which buildings are easy to lease in case they go vacant and which ones might sit vacant, like the Volkswagen plant, for 10 years. And
Mhm.
we only buy small buildings that any entrepreneurial company could occupy. The chances are it won't stay vacant. If a tenant leaves, it won't stay vacant for longer than about 6 months. That's
Yeah.
our, if we think this is going to be
Yep.
vacant longer, we won't buy it, even if there's a 5 or 7 year lease, because eventually the tenant might leave.
Yeah. Gotcha. So are your leases uh 30 years? Did you ever do the 99 years? What's the
No, no, it realistically for what we do, which is called B and C industrial, not those
okay?
giant buildings that you see on the side of the highway with the loading docks lined up, and then there's glass on both sides where they have the offices, and you see
Yep.
trucks and trailers. We don't do that. We buy these smaller buildings that are between, let's say, 15,000 and 50,000 square feet,
Okay.
that any tenant who makes a product would like the building. And if, even more important, if we ever want to sell it, we'll sell it to a user, which is someone who's in the manufacturing business from the area, as opposed to selling it on a cap rate to an investor. We do not sell to investors because the
Yeah.
premium to sell it to someone in the neighborhood who's going to use the business, the building, as a tool for their business. Let's look at it that way. It's not really real estate to them. To them, they've got 15 machines, they've got to put them somewhere. The building is as much of a tool as the machines are. Without the building, they can't operate the other machines. So we sell to users, and usually it's someone within walking distance that buys one of these buildings when we sell them.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
premium,
Well,
there's a premium price. The premium's usually 25 to 40% higher than it would be if we sold it on a cap rate.
did you know that you can participate in class every Monday? We call it Monday Night Live, 7 p.m. Eastern, with me and dozens of other investor agents from around the country, in fact, the world. Every Monday, totally free. No selling, no recruiting, just straight up education on anything and everything in real estate. And we have a lot of good guests coming on once or twice a month, bringing in expertise on subjects like how to buy a house with crypto. Okay. How about them apples? What about AI? How's AI affecting our business? How about the metaverse, blockchain processing? We're already using it in title work. So come on to Monday Night Live. Be ready to take notes and ask questions, because it's live and engaging, and you get to participate by asking questions and meeting others. So we'll see you there. Go to realestatewithgarywilson.com, click on the resource tab, drop down, and you'll see Monday Night Live. And in there, you can see one of the most recent classes. But more importantly, you can register for class, as many as you want, going up to like the end of the year, I believe. So in any case, do that. We'll see you on Monday Night Live. Look forward to meeting you in person. Take care. Yeah. Well, I like the model and the niche, because you're right. It's probably um, you know, big enough to have utility, right? And have demand, but small enough. I'm not saying you're flying under the radar screen, but you're not competing with with the Sonys and the GMs and all that kind of stuff, and the people that deal with that. I mean, plus where you are now, it all makes sense. I mean, you're literally in Chicago, and it really is the center of the country, and that urban sprawl goes out for miles. I mean, you've got, the like you said, you would never run out of opportunities there. So that all makes sense. Now, if you don't mind, I want to touch on the whole concept of no debt because I want everybody listening here. I used to be in debt up to my eyeballs when I first got started. Just everything you heard, everything you learned, everything you were taught was, you know what, man, you can borrow up to 80%, 90%. And there were times when lenders would lend you, this was insane, but I had 125% equity loan. I'm like, and I was a banker. I thought, are you nuts? But
Yeah.
they did it, and then you'll see what happened. But as time went on, guys, I started cutting back, and my ratios improved dramatically. And the less debt I had as a percentage of the overall ownership, the better life got to the point where actually in 2015, I rid of my last mortgage. I haven't been in debt since December 2015. And I'm telling you, life is way, way better right now. So I want you to listen to this. So Joel, did you ever have debt or was it always you just
Yeah.
paid? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I did my first few deals back in the early times with Milt Podolsky and in those
Mhm.
days and Steve Podolsky in that group with no debt. And then I brought in a young partner, 10 years younger. Guy is 6'5", high school quarterback, full ride scholarship at Northwestern, married a surgeon, just a sophisticated, good looking, friendly, compelling
Mhm.
guy. And I brought him in and I taught him the business. I was pretty much what I would call a mentor for a big number of people over the years. And
Okay.
this guy was my best. He was the best I ever saw. So I asked him to
Mhm.
be my partner. And he loved the model of syndicating and finding deals. But he said, "Hey, Joel, we can make so much more money for ourselves and our investors if we borrow money. You should stop doing all cash deals." I said, "Dave,
Mm.
that makes me uncomfortable." He says, "No, come on, let's do it. Let's do it."
Mhm.
So about 2003, we went crazy buying buildings. And it's so much easier if you borrow money because you don't need as many partners. Raising money is hard work. You got to
Yeah.
explain each deal to each partner because we don't do funds,
Mhm.
we do deal by deal. And I said to Dave, I'm getting more and more uncomfortable the more we borrow. And he said, "Come on, real estate's a leverage business." So in
Mhm.
2008, we had 50 buildings, 50 industrial buildings. We
Yeah.
had one in Ohio and two in Florida and one in New York and a bunch here. And we had all kinds of debt. And then in 2008, the market crashed.
Mhm.
Tenants, some of them went out of business. Some of their leases came up and they didn't renew, they moved out. And we had some vacancy. Now it was like Milt Podolsky. I had 10 vacant buildings and we were in a recession. But those 10 they suck everything out of you because the carrying cost is so high. And
Mhm.
so I had 7 banks and I had guarantees on all 50 loans because that's how we did it in those days.
Right.
Stupid. Personal guarantees. Dumb, 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 dumb. But
Yeah.
I did it. And I ended up in a severe depression. I was I was really
Mhm.
devastated. I thought maybe I had lost everybody's money. I had 200
Mhm.
investors. And I ended up on that couch back there and I couldn't get off for months. I thought
Yeah.
when you're in a depression, I'm very familiar with mental health because of what I went through. And I
Yeah.
have great empathy for people who have mood disorders because, boy, I had one mood disorder that just lasted and it was just a down.
Yeah.
And I came out of it. I worked really hard to save the portfolio and not lose. We lost one building to foreclosure and we gave the keys back on one, but that meant that the other 48 were rescued with a
Good.
tremendous amount of work. And I decided that from now on, I can't take emotionally. I
Right.
cannot take being in a position where I'm ashamed of what I did because I took too much risk. Shame is a
Yeah.
really big thing in depression.
Oh
When you
yeah.
feel shame, you feel it deep down in your gut.
Yeah.
And I decided no more of that. I can't do that again. And that's when I started doing nothing but debt-free deals.
Yeah.
Now, now that changed. I recently did a deal where I actually borrowed 30%, 30% loan to value ratio
Okay.
because it was a $13 million deal and I could
Mhm.
only raise 9 million. before we closed. So in order to close, we borrowed 3.9 million and we put 9.1 million of equity in.
Okay.
And I felt sick about it because I didn't want to do it, but it was a deal we wanted to make. And so the deal we made with the bank was we can go syndicate the 3.9 million and make it an all cash deal anytime we want and pay them back as we raise money. So it was more or less like a bridge loan,
Correct.
but it was
Yeah.
at bank rates. So it wasn't a stupidly high interest rate. It was a fair, lower interest rate.
Right.
But yeah,
Well, they
so
had first position.
yes, they have
Yeah.
first position, but it's 30%. So we believe that the properties are probably worth a little more than we paid just to start. We
Mhm.
paid 13 million. We believe they're worth 15 million. Our loan is, let's call it 4. So we have 11 of equity. And we have leases there. We bought 5 acres on the Chicago River with
Mhm.
3 buildings occupied by manufacturers with good credit with 7-year leases. So we've got 7 years to land this thing and get the other 3.9 million syndicated.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what is is it possible to expand further because I want to go do a case study, and that was interesting because you'd years ago gone back to just working with cash and no debt, and yet this one was compelling enough to take on some debt. Granted, it's only a 30% loan to value loan, and at the bank, I mean, I used to be a banker. That would be like a shoe in, like where do we sign?
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
that kind of a loan. But is it part of your plan to uh to release the debt? In other words, bring in a few more investors. Kind of give us the pretend like this is one of those flipping shows, but we're not flipping. We're talking about industrial space, and give us
Yeah.
the rundown if you don't mind sharing.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'll give you background on the properties.
Okay.
They were bought by a family that had a
Mhm.
business, and the business was making fruit juice concentrate. You may know of the brand. It's big in the Hispanic community, but it's also in 50 countries. It's called Tampico.
Yes. Yep.
It's fruit juice, punches. They have all kinds of products. They actually do fruit popsicles, things like that. And so they occupy these buildings. They do $350 million a year. I know this because I read it in an article. They didn't give me their financial statements, which, by the way, is a problem. I had to figure it out. They had no obligation to tell me what their financial situation was. So I had to determine it. But they do 350 million in sales from what I can tell. And they've been in business for 30 years. But it was started by a family 30 years ago who built it up from nothing and then sold it to a private equity group. And now the private equity group sold it to another private equity group. So it's owned by a very deep pocketed company that does $4 billion in sales. So I'm pretty comfortable that they're not going to go out of business.
Yeah.
They've
Yeah.
got different things that they do in each of the buildings. They're all along the Chicago River. We've got 1,200 feet of frontage on the Chicago River, where one day I believe that it will be converted to residential condos because of the water feature. But
Okay.
until then, we're going to collect rent from Tampico. I went out and I found the property. It was off market. I found it through some local brokers who knew that I was looking for this kind of thing. And they brought it to us and we negotiated the deal, and it took us 2.5 years to get it closed because the family wanted 15 million and I wanted to pay 11 million.
Yeah.
So what do you end up at? 13 million, right in between. The problem was it took me a long time to come up from my 11 and it took them a long time to come down from their 15. And so there were months at a time where it just went quiet. There was no negotiating going on. They just said, forget it. If you're not going to pay 14 million, forget it. I said, forget it. If you won't take 12 million, forget it. And the brokers we drove the broker nuts because he's in the middle of this thing and he thinks he's going to make a commission, a 6-figure commission. And every so often the deal just goes dormant. But we eventually came to terms with them. And the family consisted of a mother. The father had passed away, a mother, 2 daughters, one in Hawaii, one in London, and a son who has a business here. He's in the race car business. This family had owned it for a long time, and I think they just wanted to get the asset out of the family. There are grandchildren involved. I think they just wanted to get the money out. And perhaps the reason they came down to 13 million from 15 is they just figured it's time to get it out of the family. So I went out immediately to my investor group. I put together, I'm looking around to see if I have it. Yeah, I put together something called a private placement memorandum. That's what this is. It's electronic, and I also print them. And you can see the Chicago River and see the building in the background and see downtown in the way background.
Yep.
So it's a beautiful neighborhood, a very safe, insulated neighborhood where there's some very high-end residential around it, which is why I think it's going to be a residential redevelopment, maybe in 7 years when the leases are up.
Yeah.
I sent out an email to my investors. I've got a group that goes into most of my deals. Sometimes people don't have money at the moment and they skip. Sometimes they have more than usual and they put in more. And I went out and I raised money literally week by week by week. I was raising about $1 million a week from this group. And I had it under contract for 60 days. And so I knew that I had approximately 9 weeks. And I thought at $1 million a week, I'll get 9 million. So I wasn't sure I'd get more. So I called the bank, and my banker, Jay Dice at Union Bank, is one of my favorite people. I said, Jay, if I can't raise all the money, will you give me a really lenient loan where I can pay it off quickly and raise more money? He said, yeah, sure. How much are you borrowing? I said, 3.9 million on 13 million. He said, done. He says, and I'll do it for a point less than we charge almost everybody else because it's such a low loan to value. And I said, that's really nice. Thank you. And he said, yeah, we want the loan. It's a pretty safe sounding loan. So the way to get investors in my world is to have Zoom calls, phone calls. Nobody invests without talking to me. I have to tell the story. It's all about storytelling. And many of them, even if they're from out of town, flew in to see it. If someone was putting in $400,000 or $300,000, very often they want to see where they're putting their money. So I pick people up at O'Hare and we go to lunch and then we go look at the buildings. And it's a lot of work to raise money and tell the story over and over. But every time what happens is smart investors ask questions that maybe I didn't think of. It makes our due diligence even better for mitigating risk. And that was really great. And then we had an all hands on deck meeting. I have 8 advisors on an advisory committee. And these are my most sophisticated, smart, fabulous investors, including Steve Podolsky, my mentor from 42 years ago, who still invests in what we do. He's the smartest. He's the smartest investor. There's some other really good ones. Guy from Canada who we love, who's really smart. But we went on a Zoom call with the 8 of us, and I invited all the rest of the investors to join the Zoom call. You've seen those Zoom calls where you've got like dozens of people's faces. And so it became sort of like a town hall where everybody got to ask questions. And I said, guys, throw me your roughest, toughest questions, because if you come up with the question that we stumble on and can't answer it, we won't buy the property. And that's what we did. So that cemented it for some of the people who weren't sure, because they got to hear the smart other people talk about why they liked the deal.
That was a good idea. So, okay. Well, it sounds like you got a real winner there too. I mean, you got currently great deal and potential for repurposing a few years down the road. And I do agree, if it's on the water and there are residential around there, that's just, you know, that's where it's going. And I've seen that before. And like Pittsburgh, for example, I used to live there. When I first moved there, I remember thinking to myself, these people are completely blowing the opportunity. They weren't utilizing the waterfront. They still had these old 100-year-old smokestacks that were not even occupied. They just were run down old, factories and mills and stuff. And I thought, surely somebody sees this besides me. And I was just I'm buying duplexes at the time. I wasn't going to develop anything. But sure enough, they changed mayors. The new mayor came in and started attracting, real investors, real money, and they started developing on the waterfront. And it's completely different now. In fact, I'll just tell you guys, just the what's called Mount Washington. It's the big mountain overlooking the three rivers, the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela come together. Um, it was rated the number 2 city view in all of the United States, only behind San Francisco. Um, Pretty interesting, So in any case, um, I've seen that done. I wish other area. I hope Cleveland figures it out. There's a lot of areas around the country that could benefit from that. And Chicago is a perfect example, taking advantage of the lakefront and the river going through there. That's like, you know, thank goodness there's enough smart people there to do that. So going forward, I know we're getting short on time here. Uh, I like your style.
You want to hear the numbers? I can give you how the numbers work real quick.
Oh, please do. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah.
So it's a $13 million deal.
Mhm.
And in order for my investors to have any appetite, it has to start out at a minimum of 7%. They prefer 8 as
Mhm.
as their yield for the first year. And in this case, it's such a great location and the tenants are so good. We took 7. So
Mhm.
in order for you to get 7% on 13 million, you've got to get $910,000 net rent, where the tenant pays the taxes, insurance, maintenance, and utilities separately. So all we
Okay.
do is we collect the rent. So we're starting out at 910,000, which is a 7% return. And every year the rent goes up on a formula that's based on the consumer price index, which is the CPI. So if there's high inflation, the rent goes up very fast. If there's low inflation, it goes up slower. We're anticipating it'll go up 3 to 4% a year. So over the 7-year period, we're going to be averaging pretty close to 8% yield. And the
Okay.
investors are satisfied with that, with a deal where there's some pretty good upside. Theoretically, they could make a 16, 17, maybe even 18% average return between the yield and the profit on the sale when you divide it over the 7-year hold period. But
Okay.
Pico wants to stay longer. In fact, they've asked us for 5 more years because they have their
Okay.
employees there and they have their machines there. And you can't even imagine how complicated it is to have all these mixing pipes and mixing
Right.
bowls and mixing tanks, because they take fruit and they change it into this goop that's called
Yeah.
concentrate, and then they use the concentrate to make bottled fruit juice. So
Yeah.
they don't want to move. They're afraid of me selling it in 7 years, and they've said, please extend our lease. But we can't do that yet because we don't know what's going to happen in 7 years.
Right.
So we're holding off. But that's a case study. It's a really, I could get into far more details of the due diligence and why we like the loading docks, why we like the ceiling heights, why we like the shape of the buildings, the size of the buildings. That's all part of it. But I just to give somebody who doesn't understand industrial sort of an understanding about why we love these little industrial buildings. It's
Right.
because there's millions of people who work for companies like Tampico and manufacturers. Everything in that room you're in and everything in this office and everything in every phone and every computer is made in an industrial building and distributed from an industrial building. It's the
Yep.
supply chain of the world. And so,
Yeah.
and that will never change. It's always been the case. So I sound excited about industrial. I love it. It's just great.
Yeah. Well, how I mean, I know we've got a lot of listeners here that would definitely be interested in learning about any of the other projects you have coming up. What's the best way for people to find you and see what you're doing and even communicate with you if it's possible?
Sure. The company is called Brit, BRIT with 1 T, Brit Properties. So it's
Mhm.
britproperties.com.
Okay.
And we've got all kinds of information about our buildings and what we do and why we do it the way we do it. I can tell you the name Brit has a funny origin.
Please. Yeah. Mhm.
In the Old Testament, there's something called the covenant with God. And the
Mhm.
covenant, the Hebrew word for covenant is BRIT. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Brit, but in English, it's Brit. So
Okay.
we feel that we have a covenant with our investors and our tenants to take care of them and to have meaningful relationships. So it's a very meaningful name. But also, we value our employees. And one of our property managers was a fellow named Brad when we came up with the name for the company. And I wanted Brad to feel good, and I also wanted a second source of the name. So it also stands for Brad Really Is Terrific.
Oh,
I told Brad, said, what's the name of the company we're going to be starting now? And this was decades ago. And I said, Brad, Brit. And I told him about the covenant thing. And I said, but it's also Brad Really Is Terrific. You can tell people that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure Brad appreciates that too,
Yeah.
So getting that recognition on a regular basis. So, well, okay. So everybody, if you could, I know if you're driving, don't write this down, but you can always re-listen to this or rewatch it if you're watching it. It's britproperty.com. And I checked out the site earlier. There's a place for you to communicate there. You can see what the holdings are, see what the current projects are. And I tell you what, you know, if you just think about the one principle of not having any debt, I know the case study we just gave you is obviously an exception, but in my opinion, um, it's the downside risk is almost nil. And broadly speaking, when you have no debt, you eliminate a big source of risk. Okay, I know, Noel, your friend back in the pre-recession, probably one of the things he said is, "Hey, what could go wrong?"
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
going all that debt, and sure enough, I mean, a lot of people got smacked pretty hard. Then we were lucky. We had been at it long enough. We had lots of equity, and we were in a good position. The rents, we were still okay, but a lot of people weren't. I mean, it was the commercial debt that took the big hit too. A lot of people hear about all the foreclosures. That's true, but the people that got hurt the biggest were the commercial. I mean, those notes were getting called in left and right. So I'm just going to emphasize this again. If you're listening to this and you're serious about investing, industrial space is one of the best places to be right now. You can look it up. Number one. Number two is when you have little or no debt, you eliminate a huge source of risk. So I've never met anybody other than Joel guys that does it this way. So this is why I'm putting so much emphasis on it. So take a look at it. Thank you for participating, by the way. And Joel, thank you for giving up so much gold in a brief period of time. So that's super nice of you to do that. And I'd love to stay in touch with you. And I teach a class called Monday Night Live every Monday night at 7 Eastern. And if I might want to ask you to be on that, to just to focus on the two things, which are the cold calling and the no debt, because I constantly preach those things. And I'm sure you gathered a team of agents across the country. 80% won't do it, but 20% will, you know. And it's a
Can you tell
20% that
him
bring home the bacon.
I'm going to be giving
Yeah.
sending this podcast to my group of investors. You want to give us how somebody would get onto your Monday night calls and meet you? Why don't you give that information right here too?
Sure. Yeah, what I'll do is Beverly she's gonna let you know when it's gonna be published. And then what I'll do is I'll email you here when we're done, and I'll put that Monday Night Live link on there, and I'll do an introduction with you and Beverly too, because I think you're an excellent teacher, and I hope that all the listeners here feel the same way that I do. And I've interviewed a lot of people, several hundred, I think close to 400, and I like your style, so I might want to do some business with you too. So,
Thank you,
you know,
Gary. Really appreciate
and
it.
you're in a pretty cool place. So, well, listen, everybody, take care of yourselves, and if you could leave a review for this, it's whatever channel you're listening to, leave a review there. And before you leave the internet, make sure you go to britproperties.com. Just check it out. It's an easy site to navigate. It was just there earlier. And then before you leave, go to globalinvestoragent.com. If you are an investor, that's where you can find an agent who's trained to work with you. These are not typical agents. And if you are an agent, I'm telling you guys, if you're not making investing part of your model and working with investors, you're missing out a huge opportunity. It's literally 36% of our business is commercial, right? Investor owned property. Learn how to do it so you can make money serving them and also make money by doing your own investing. That's what you get from going to that website. So you guys take care of yourselves. God bless you and your families, and we will see you on the next Massive Passive podcast.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Massive Passive Cash Flow. Be sure to go to realestatewithgarywilson.com to join our community and start building wealth today.